welcome to The Digital Patient, where we discuss the latest advancements in digital patient engagement and share stories from the front lines. I'm your host, Alan Sardana, and with me as always is SeamlessMD CEO, Dr. Joshua Liu. Today we are joined by our very special guest, Dr. Dusadee Sarangarm. Dr. Sarangarm is an associate professor in the Department of Emergency Medicine at the University of New Mexico. She is dual boarded in emergency medicine and clinical informatics. She became the associate CMIO for the health system in 2011 and was promoted to CMIO in spring of 2020. Dr. Sarangarm was born in Thailand and grew up in New Mexico. She graduated from the New Mexico State University in 2003 and University of New Mexico School of Medicine in 2008. She completed her emergency medicine residency at University of New Mexico and became faculty in 2011. Her current passions are creating systems and leading teams that improve ease of practice for providers, address systemic inefficiencies, standardize care, and alleviate suffering for patients. Dusadee, Dr. Sarangarm, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much, Alan.
It's amazing. Yeah, and Josh. Yeah, we'll throw that in. It's amazing to have you on the show. I did a little bit of research on you, and I actually found a pretty interesting discovery. It seemed like you won an award back in 1999 at the annual New Mexico High School Supercomputing Challenge. And can you tell us a bit more about that competition and whether that means you were always kind of technology inclined?
You dug real deep there, Alan. That's like in the archives of the interweb. You found that. That's what, like 20 years ago?
Yeah, I think maybe page 14 of Google or like even beyond. Yeah.
Okay, well, so the supercomputing challenge, from what I remember of it, because I think I was 16 at the time, has been in place in New Mexico since like the early 1990s, something like that. And it's really a pipeline program to encourage, at the time, high school students, I think they do middle school students now too, to go into engineering and computer science fields. And basically you do a science project and then they run it on a supercomputer, which, I mean, let's be honest, no one's high school project needed supercomputer computational power, but it was really cool to get to do that at the time. And so yeah, you outed me. I'm a total nerd. You found that out from 1999. So that's great, Alan. Good job.
I love that. So despite these obvious early achievements in technology, you decided to pursue emergency medicine. What sparked the interest there?
So funny story. My parents are so Asian, like most Asian. And before I was born, my dad decided to name me Dusadee, which in Thai means doctor. And so I was either going to become a doctor or be his like greatest life failure. And so I kind of knew from a pretty early age that I was going to medicine, even when I went into engineering for a while. And so that was sort of always the plan, was to end up in medicine. Engineering was just
very cool.
That's a really great opener for any like med school residency interview. Like
I know, right? Like it was meant to be.
I love that. I really like that. You also shared in the past and previous conversations that informatics kind of fell into your lap, and we hear that a lot, but I'm so curious, like, what does that mean for you? How did it fall into your lap? And how do you think coming from the clinical world actually helped your efforts in tackling things from a digital perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I guess for me, it fell into my lap in the sense that if you had asked me when I started medical school that I would end up doing clinical informatics 10 years later, I would have just laughed at you, right? Like that was not at all in the plans. I never intended to have chief anything in my title. I just wanted to take care of patients and make the world a better place. And what happened was in residency, I got asked a couple of times to work on, a couple of informatics type projects. We went live with the transition from paper charting to electronic charting, and we started using Vocera in the emergency department. And one of the faculty members at the time asked me if I wanted to help, and I was like, yes, anything to make our lives better. Like I would absolutely love to have a hand in that. So I did. And you know, one thing leads to another. You say yes to enough things and people are like, hey, well, maybe you should have some authority to make some decisions. And I'm like, really? You want to give me authority? All right, I'll take that. So that's what happened. And it just took off from there.
I kind of like that it fell into your lap, because then it wasn't like you were pursuing tech for the sake of pursuing tech. You were focused on, how do I make lives easier for our clinical teams or patients? And like, oh, tech is a tool to help do that. But that wasn't the end goal. Like, the end goal wasn't to implement technology. It was to achieve an outcome. So I love the fact that you just like followed your curiosity, your interest, and I guess it just ended up being formalized over time. That's an awesome story.
I mean, I think that resonates with people, right? Like when you have a genuine desire to make something better, not for personal gain. Like I had no, still, I mean, it's lovely that I have a title and that's great. That's not why I do the work that I do. And so it's nice to be recognized for it. But I think that recognition really comes when the work comes from inside, right? Like when you're really wanting to make things better for patients and for your colleagues. People realize that's how it landed in my lap.
So I'm curious, at this point, like are you still that same person where like you're not really thinking so much about the next coolest tech, or have you kind of shifted a bit where like now you are a bit more like, oh, like that's cool tech, I want to look into that? Like where do you sit on that spectrum nowadays?
I think it could be both, right? Like I think we've established I'm a nerd. So I don't know that part of me is going to ever change. I've been a nerd for as long as I remember. But I've also, at the same time, really care about making patients' lives better and making it easier for my colleagues to do their jobs so that they can take care of more patients. And so I still do both. I still really geek out when there's like a new technology that can make the world a better place. Like, yeah, let's do that. And at the same time, I am here for the people, because the people are really what makes the job fun, right? It's not the whatever cool piece of technology. That's just like a nice bonus.
Right. Yeah. And, speaking of fun, you took on the CMIO role formally at a very challenging time in history, right at the beginning of the pandemic or just before even. And that must have been incredibly stressful and maybe and hopefully equally rewarding. You've mentioned in the past how disaster recovery is even harder than disaster response. And you're really an integral part in both of those equations, first in the response and now in the recovery. What's been the biggest challenge post COVID as a CMIO?
I mean, I really do stand by that disaster recovery is way harder than the disaster response part. And I think it boils down to some level of entropy, right? Like in disaster response, it's really, you're like, okay, I'm just going to build this new system and it works for that moment, but then that system doesn't work afterwards, and it's now created all sorts of chaos, this new system that you've developed. And so you have to pick from that new system the best parts and then leave aside the one, like go back to the way things were when you can. And then there's a hybrid for the rest of it. So I think that really making those decisions is hard. Specific to healthcare, I think this is no surprise to anybody, right? Like there's not enough to go around of anything right now. There's not enough people. There's not enough like intellectual resources, meaning we've lost a lot of the people from the organization that had all that knowledge in their heads. They've either gone to other organizations or they've left the field entirely. So I think that's been very hard. And then as a direct result of that, I think the finances are really hard right now for a lot of organizations. So now, and I happen to love this because I'm a weirdo, but so now the challenge is to do with what you have, right? And potentially less than what you had before. That means more optimization. That means automation. That means like being creative and digging in, because sure, if you have all the resources, you have all the money, you have all the people, it's a lot easier to do something Like trying to do the same thing with less, that's where the grit comes in, right? And so that's the work I like. So it is harder, and it's also fun.
Can I ask you, like, I totally agree with you, by the way, because I think in many ways, like, scarcity of resources, like, and constraints, like, force us to be, like you said, be more creative, or maybe to figure out the right way of doing things so we don't have all the slack and unlimited resources in the world. But, you know, not everyone maybe gravitates towards seeing challenges as opportunities. I'm curious, like, any suggestions on how do you communicate that internally when, like, people are like burned out, they're stressed, they may not be as naturally optimistic as we are, and any suggestions on how you get people excited about seeing things as opportunities and not just challenge after challenge after challenge?
Yeah, Josh, you know, it's funny. Just this week, I was at a presentation and I said, I'm a brutally optimistic person. Maybe that's why it makes it so easy for me to see these things the way I do. You know, in all seriousness, though, I really think it comes back down to tying people back to their why, right? Like, why are you here? Like, because people don't, I mean, yes, they work for a paycheck. That's not really why they give, right? I don't have to give myself, even if I'm getting my paycheck. If you're giving extra, then it's because you care. So what is it that you care about? Like, and really finding that in people as individuals is the challenge, I think, in corporate America. And like building those teams up as individual teams. I don't know how else to say it, but really the why, I think, is what we have to focus on.
It's kind of like, I mean, to your point, healthcare is such a complicated, challenging industry. If someone decides to work in healthcare, there's almost always a bigger reason why, because otherwise, frankly, like, I think we're all a little bit irrational to be in healthcare, especially right now. Like, if you weren't like passionate about the mission of a healthcare organization, like, frankly, you probably would be happier doing something else. It's just, why else would you take all the stress and the burnout, and unless you really cared about the mission of your organization? So that makes a lot of sense to me.
Exactly.
So, you know, I guess how we connected, Dusadee, was, you know, I saw you on that great panel at Becker's digital health event a couple weeks ago, and you were on the panel called Patient Experience 2.0, how to reach patients in 2023 and beyond. And one of the things that you said in the Q&A that I really enjoyed was related to staff shortages and the patient experience. And so you said something like, yes, like, staff shortages are a huge issue for hospitals, but one of the things that we have to realize is that our patients are not thinking about these challenges. They're really focused on their own patient experience, and so it's easy for us to get caught up in the weeds and lose kind of our sense of empathy with patients. And so I thought that was a really good reminder that our patients aren't always thinking about our problems. And so I guess, how do you keep the team motivated to keep patients at the center of your decisions when all these other things in the organization are going on that feel so far away from the patients in some ways?
Well, I'll tell you how I do it for myself. And then I pretty much do the same thing for my teams, which is that I think about my mom.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I ask myself, like, you've designed this great product for patients, you know, this is your patient portal or whatever. Can my mom use it? And if my mom can't use it, I mean, I don't know, you guys, right? Like, who else are we designing for except for each other, for our loved ones, for our dear friends? If we don't do a better job at personalizing medicine, not just for our patients, but like for our own teams, making them understand that this is for us, this is for our communities, for our people, then I don't know how we're going to ever be successful, right? And so that's all I do. It's not complex, but I ask people, I'm like, well, would your mom understand this? No. Okay, well, let's go back to the drawing board. Let's figure out how to do this better. I just think that sometimes the simplest solutions are the best.
You know, and I think sometimes, like, people, when we come from like the clinical world, because we know the medical jargon, we know like all these clinical use cases and terminologies, we do forget that 99% of the population does not benefit from having like 5, 10, 20, 30 years of clinical experience. And so they need a lot more support. On that note, you recently shared a post on LinkedIn about, I think, where you said health literacy shows our patients respect and care about them. And I remember, like, on the panel, you also spoke very strongly about the importance of applying health literacy and how we engage with patients. So could you tell us a bit more maybe about your views on health literacy and how important that is when engaging patients digitally as well, not just like verbally or on paper?
Sure. Josh, I feel like in medicine, we have this reward system where the more big words you use, the more you're rewarded, right? That's why we have words like board me for stomach noises. That's why we have that word, I don't know, but we do. And then once you add that to sort of business lingo, it becomes really easy to use sentences with lots of fancy language that say nothing, right? And so I think our jobs as clinicians is to take that language and to give it to patients in a way that's digestible and comprehensible. They don't care if we use big language or not, right? They just want to know how to make their blood pressure better. So again, this is about taking the patient experience and making it the most important part of the work, like really looking at human-centered design when you're designing products and you're just building systems, really thinking like, is that going to work for human beings, other human beings? So really, I think health literacy speaks a lot to caring about what patients think and what they understand, not what we're just giving them, right? Because that's about us. What we say is about us. What they understand is about them, which is what healthcare should be about. From the digital perspective, I think you can just take those same principles and make sure that you apply them digitally. So at UNM, we have a health literacy team, and they sit on our patient portal committee, for instance, and they review the language that we put on our patient portal committee. They try, within the constraints of the technology, they try to help us make sure the links make sense and the placement of the links makes sense, and look at it from a really patient-centric perspective, because as much as we try, we don't always hit that out of the park every time, but having that perspective there reminds us how important it is. So that's what we do at UNM.
Yeah, I love that. And especially just the idea of simplifying the message from, this overcomplicated jargon down to the most important thing, so that a patient can actually feel empowered and know what to do and what's being asked of them. I actually think it takes a very smart person to be able to simplify it down to the essence of what needs to be communicated. I'm curious, do you have any stops in place or checks and balances in place to actually meet with the patient and brainstorm with them, or have them as part of the co-design process? Like what does that look like, and how do you foster that type of culture at UNM?
So we actually have 2 patient portal committees at the risk of having too much bureaucracy. One is an internal committee that's focused more on the technical pieces, like the governance pieces, but we also have a committee that includes patient representatives and community representatives to make sure that we get the whole patient perspective. So it's not just internal. We do try to capture that as part of our processes. Now, does that sometimes slow things down? Of course it does. Is it important? Yes, it is important, because the patient portal is for patients. So, yeah.
Well, I love that. Just designing for the end user with the end user in mind makes a lot of sense. You kind of brought up another point that I wanted to ask around, risk versus innovation. And I think there's sometimes this intricate balance between, do we choose to innovate, or are we, risk averse and we don't need to try these new things? What's your take on that balance, and how do you ensure that innovation can still happen?
Oof, that's a tough question, Alan, really, because especially when you're looking at it from an executive level, right? Because I think healthcare in general is risk averse. People are operating on very tight margins, especially now. We're dealing with people's lives, which you don't want to have someone who's not risk averse dealing with your life, right? So no one wants you experimenting on them. I think you have to be able to fail fast. And that is tough depending on the type of project, because some projects you are full and committed. And there's no failing and changing your mind, right? You're like, I am taking up this new EMR and it's going to be $1 bajillion if I fail. And so I'm doing it. It's happening. And then there are other things that we take that same mentality over kind of smallish decisions. And I'm like, come on, guys, just turn it on. And if it sucks, turn it off. You know what I mean? Like, it's not that hard to do for some smaller things. So we really have to weigh how big the decision is. And for the smaller decisions, I think we in healthcare could be better about failing faster.
Mm-hmm. Can I ask you, Dusadee, like in terms of at UNM, when you think about your digital transformation strategy, like oftentimes I hear that, you know, it can't be one size fits all across, let's say, the United States, because every region, every state has different, you know, population needs and accessibility needs and whatnot. So for example, I know that our friends over in Alabama, you know, they have particularly low health literacy level. So for them, like yourselves, like health literacy is a very big thing there, whereas maybe in some other more, you know, educated, affluent regions, health literacy is not at the top of the list, or the reading level can be a bit higher maybe in some regions. I'm curious, when you think about digital in New Mexico, are there certain like factors that you tend to prioritize in terms of how you think about reaching patients locally?
I mean, certainly we have issues all the way at the foundational level, right? Like some people simply don't have access to the internet the way that we do. And so that limits things like remote monitoring and virtual visits. And I mean, it goes on and on. That's sort of foundational. And so really working on that, I think, is important. I think the state's doing some good things around that in New Mexico. We also we did a study in the emergency department. We found that Spanish-speaking patients have an even lower health literacy than our English-speaking patients, and that's with interpreters there. So it's not, you know, a language problem. It just is the way it is in New Mexico, and so knowing that is helpful when you're speaking with Spanish-speaking patients. And I think just really working on the socioeconomic factors that are not all controllable within a healthcare system, right? That's like a multifactorial issue, I think, is how we're going to move things forward in that realm.
It's fascinating to me how like I think this is common sense now, but I think people have finally realized that a lot of the most important healthcare like problems need to be solved not purely from like a medical treatment or clinical point of view, but to your point, from social determinants of health or other factors. I remember, like, I think for me where it really hit home was, I don't know, it's probably like 10, 15 years ago, I think, when I think Atul Gawande wrote this like article called Hotspotters. And I think it was it the New Yorker that he writes in or something like that? But it kind of covered this concept. And there's a really good story about how there was a patient who kept, you know, I think he has COPD, and he kept bouncing in and out of the hospital. And they can never figure out like how to basically like prevent those readmissions and those ED visits, until one day, one of his healthcare workers just like wanted to learn where did he live, what were the triggers in the environment, and they realized, oh, actually, like where he lived had all of these like pollutants in the air, and the air quality was low, and he had all these triggers for COPD. And it turned out it was actually cheaper as a health system to pay for him to live in a better, cleaner area than to keep paying for the high healthcare costs of like the readmissions and the ED visits. So it's like, it was better for him, it was cheaper for the system to just solve the root cause problem. But we're so used to, I think, in healthcare, to your point, like we often focus so much on the acute issue and like reacting to it, but a lot of the healthcare issues start and something that traditionally wasn't healthcare related, but I guess now is. I think people recognize that now, but it's striking to me that so many of these issues don't start way earlier, like upstream.
Oh, sure. I mean, right. Treating a symptom is often so much easier than treating the disease, right? Like I can make a fever go away like that. making their sepsis go away. It's a little harder. So yeah.
So
Yeah,
true.
totally makes sense. Now, Dusadee, another thing I wanted to bring up. So one of you've already mentioned in the conversation, but one of your very first projects on the technology side that you were working with was implementing digital charting. And I think it's really relevant to bring it up today because that project was using this, NLP, which at the time was pretty novel. And given at today's date, this evolution of technology and how digital charting has become even more advanced, and there's this promise of using natural language processing to get the clinicians away from the documentation side and back to in person with the patients. Given that this evolution has occurred and is constantly evolving with technology, what sort of frameworks are you using to determine an initial success on implementation? And then does the project end at go live for you, or how do you look at the entire cycle of that type of innovation?
I'm going to take your second question first, Alan, because I really think that my job is never done. I think that's probably good job security, but every single project that I do, there's always, there's the initial change phase, right? That can happen fairly quickly, the conversion. The transition, the acceptance of the change, the adoption, usually takes a long time. And so if you think your job is done after the conversion's done, then you're likely not doing a really good job, honestly, because people don't just make change happen internally, right? They may do it, but they may not want to, or whatever. That creates its own set of challenges. So how I measure success initially, I think there's a lot of ways to tackle this problem. A lot of people like the data, right? Especially when you're looking at the executive level. They want to see so many lives saved, or so much time decreased, or so many, millions of dollars saved, or whatever. I think if you've done any research at all, you understand how muddy data really is. It's not as clean and clear cut as we would like it to be. And while it may look good, it may not actually reflect just an improvement in technology. It's, as we all know, it's typically a change in people, process, and technology. And so, I like to rely on a little bit of data, but I frankly don't trust it as much as I probably should. In some cases, how I know something works is I go work clinically, and I will find out immediately if people are actually using the tool, and how happy they are with the tool. You just have to get in the front lines and you will know immediately. That speaks volumes to me, more than a number. So that's usually what I do to figure out if something's working or not.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Have you ever had like an implementation and you go and you work the front lines and you see how it's being used and you realize it's not at all being used? Does that happen?
Both ways. It's gone both ways, where I've implemented something and it has just taken a life of its own, and people are like, well, let's do this with it, let's do that with it, and how about we do this? And then other times people are like, that doesn't work at all. Right. Like, okay, so back to the drawing board with this one.
Just like when that happens, like were there some commonalities in the difference in uptake? Like, was it that for the ones where there was, let's say, low adoption or engagement, was it more of like they didn't see value right away? Was it more like it was just too burdensome on the workflow? Like, any commonalities in why things didn't work out initially?
I think it almost always comes down to human-centered design. So people have an idea about how things should work. They don't actually do the work. And so, they're like, well, all they have to do is click these 3 extra buttons. Yeah, but it's not in their workflow. They have to think to go find those 3 extra buttons. Why would they do that? So that's usually why. It's like, well, they could do that, but why would they? And they don't. People are then like surprised that it's not working. That's just part of the PDSA cycle. I think you have to be really, back to the whole failing fast thing, right? I think you have to be willing to accept that things are going to not work, and that the goal isn't to hit it out of the park every time. The goal is to keep hitting, right? Because eventually eventually you're going to find something that works. You just have to keep trying.
Mm-hmm. I love that.
That's also probably why it's so important that you have like CMIOs and other like clinical informatic leaders there who are still clinical, because in some ways, at the very least, you can sort of like dog food your own products. Like you hopefully have some of the same workflows, so then you will naturally see like why you would or wouldn't. I'll either temper that because like if you're a very tech savvy person, for you it's obvious to click those 3 buttons, but to be fair, maybe it's not obvious for 99% of your colleagues clinically. So at least you can kind of dog food it, I guess, but you have to be, you have to sort of separate your own personal like savviness from like everyone else sometimes, I guess.
Oh, totally. Yeah, completely. What I think is easy, may not be easy to everyone else. And so really doing good usability testing and all of that is just, it has to be part of the process.
Mm-hmm.
For sure. I also wanted to ask you, sorry, totally different topic, but you've kind of been part of some like University of New Mexico like resources and talks on like, I think it was called like Dr. Google and Internet Myths, and like trying to basically better educate consumers on how to get appropriate like medical information online. And so, now like, gosh, like patients are finding information. It used to be just Google that we thought about. Now it's like people are getting information on like social media. They're getting educated on like TikTok and other things. I'm curious, like your take on like what role like providers and health systems should be playing on like using some of these new social media like platforms to educate patients. Like should we be doing that as providers? Should we be sticking to like what's going on in our like one-to-one relationships with patients? Like any thoughts on what we should be doing?
Should is a tough question. I'll tell you what I think. I don't know that everyone would agree, but I think when UpToDate was first conceived, people were like, why are we using this? We have PubMed where the literature is. No one has time to go read like a full article, right? I think you had UpToDate maybe as one of your topics at one point, and that has been wildly successful. Wouldn't it be wonderful if we had a resource like that for patients that they could read and understand? I think UpToDate's too much for a patient level. And we have discharge instructions, it's true, but they're really tied to the EMR for the most part. And then we have some organizations like the Mayo Clinic and Medline, they have their own resources, but I don't know that there's any of them that have quite the adoption that UpToDate had. And so if there were one and it was consistently vetted and truly up to date, I think that would be something that would be welcome by most clinicians, because otherwise we're fielding questions that are some of it's just folklore. It's just like really not based on science. And being able to point people in that direction to a trusted source and not just any source on Google or whatever your search engine of choice is, I think would be overall better.
That's a very interesting point, because it's funny because when I think about like maybe for some other topics and domains, I'm trying to think about like, so UpToDate's a good example of like if I want information specifically for clinical stuff, like I would go there. And there's probably a few other like websites I might go to for different topics as like a trusted resource. But to your point, as a consumer, as a patient, if I want to look up something about my health, most people are just going into Google, even though I know, let's say the Mayo Clinic consumer resource exists and that brand is, let's call it strong, I still don't naturally go there and look things up. And so there's an opportunity, to your point, for someone who's credible and a credible like organization to actually be the trusted source for consumer like health information, but it doesn't really exist yet.
Well, and the question about the delivery, how do you deliver that information? Sure, social media, a web page, an app. I mean, there's like a whole slew of ways we could deliver that information to patients. But the actual resource itself, I don't know that exists right now. And if it does, I would like to have that resource because then I can point my family to it.
Exactly. Dusadee, I wanted to get your take on, today there's this explosion of patient-facing innovations. There's everything from chatbots to digital care journeys and remote patient monitoring. I'm really curious, what is most exciting to you today and over the next little while?
I'm going to be really boring here. and not that I don't care about innovation, I absolutely do, but I think I think if we want to reach the most people right now, if we could just develop better workflows around texting, that would reach tons of people, because not everyone has an Instagram account, and not everyone wants to do virtual visits, and not everyone even has a patient portal. Almost everyone texts, right? And so if we had more robust texting workflows, I think that would be the entryway into a lot of technologies for patients, right? You can link to a patient portal, you can out of a text, you can link to social media, but actually reaching them is the first step. And the easiest way to do that is through text messaging. And like I said, there are text messaging applications. I don't know that they are as good as we would like them to be. When you look at how well WhatsApp has been adopted, or I don't know, any number in Asia, it's Line, right? How those have been adopted, we could really take advantage of those, I think, in healthcare to better reach patients. And we don't right.
And in your mind, I guess, do you hope that providers get on board with this, or do you expect, whether through chatbots or similar automation, that most of that will end up being automated with some subset being escalated to providers? Any thoughts on what you think ends up making the most sense?
Whether providers are going to be on board with something like this is going to have to do with the way it's funded, right? Because from the purely provider perspective, clinician perspective, right now it's all about one more thing. You want me to call the insurance company for a PA. You want me to see patients in 10 minutes. You want me to do all this paperwork. I have to do all this training. It's just like, I have to answer portal messages. I have to do these refills. It's like, when does it stop, right? And so unless we create an incentive system, a payment system that makes sense, that captures all of the work that clinicians are doing day in and day out, that isn't direct patient care, I think it's always going to be perceived as just one more thing. So from the patient perspective, do I think it's the right thing to do? I do. Absolutely. To make this viable from a provider and clinician perspective, I think we need to relook at how our payment structures work.
It's such an important point, Dusadee, because I remember all the time I'll run into, really well-intentioned technologists or product people who, in their own experience as a patient, see all these, let's call it, outdated patient experiences and technology that should be better. And then often it's easy to go into then say, hey, I found this problem in healthcare that I can solve with technology. But then if you don't come from the healthcare world, you don't realize that, to your point, often technology is not the limitation. It's funding models, it's misaligned incentives, it's existing workflows and behaviors and change management. Technology actually is actually one of the easiest things to solve in many ways in healthcare. It's all the other things that, until you're in healthcare, you don't actually realize and understand it. You have to fix those and not just the tech. So I thought you really spoke to that well. It's so much more complicated than the tech piece. It's that's just the reality that we're in healthcare.
It is. I think we can. Back to me being brutally optimistic. I think that this it's not a problem that's not solvable, though, right? We can solve this, and if we can get clinicians more engaged around this, I think we have a better chance of solving it. Because in the past, I feel like clinicians are a little bit like, this is beneath me, right? The business of medicine isn't something that I deal with. This is not, that's how we ended up where we're at today. We need to really engage around this and talk about what it would take to make it so that we can put the patient back in the center of the experience and not sort of on the periphery of all these other things that we have to do on a day-to-day. Because it's also like the flip side of that coin is it's also not okay for us to say, well, the patients are the only things I want to do, right? Like that's just not that's not a realistic view of what it's like to adult, right? Like my job involves more than just the one thing I like to do. It's certainly, I think, the most important thing, but there's going to be other things about taking care of patients beyond just, the patient encounter. So there's some balance of those two things I think is achievable. We just have to put the right energy in it. Medicine has some of the smartest people. Like we can fix this if this is something we really care about.
No, I appreciate that. It's a good reminder that there is kind of this symbiotic relationship between the system and the providers in the system for the patients. I really appreciate that. And I think it's kind of hinting back to what you were talking about earlier around change management being one of the most crucial parts of any technology. It's the change and the technology. I'm just curious, before we flip over to the Fast Five, do you have any specific strategies that you use to really, affect change management at a broad level?
Ooh. I think it depends on what you're doing, right? It depends. I will say that in any situation, understanding the relationships you have with people is just super important. And then really focusing on like understanding the problem to begin with, because so often we don't fully understand the problem. We don't ask all the whys. We don't really dig in because it's so much easier to go to the solution. I have the answer, and the answer is X, and it's often a technology fix. And just as Josh said, like it doesn't always fix things the way we would think, and there's often unintended consequences to those. And so really understanding the problem, really digging in and building those relationships with the people involved. I think you have to do those two things. If you don't do those two things and you're successful, then you were just lucky.
Yeah, I love that. All right, well, let's flip over, just being mindful of your time. Let's flip over to the Fast Five. This is basically 5 questions to get to know you better for our audience. First question we have, Dusadee, what is your favorite book or book you've gifted the most?
I would say The Art of Happiness by the Dalai Lama and Howard Keller.
I love it. Question 2, who is a person, either dead or alive, you'd love to meet?
My grandfather, on my mom's side. He passed away when I was really young, and I'm certain has an amazing life story. He immigrated from China to Thailand and then built like this huge rubber plantation in the south of Thailand, and from, like his bare hands. And I just would really love to hear that whole story from him.
Wow, that's awesome. Question 3, would you rather have super strength, super speed, or the ability to read people's minds?
If I tell you, will you tell me?
Sure, yeah.
Okay. I think I would pick super speed because that's the only one out of the 3 that actually gives me any more time back. And time, I think, is the most precious commodity we could possibly have.
Yeah, I love that. I don't want to answer for Josh, but I think we have the same answer.
Is it speed?
Yeah.
It's speed, yeah. So I answer speed as well. And the reason being mind reading, it sounds great and all, but do you really want to hear that? And then can you turn it off? And your own mind is already so filled with thoughts, like that'd be insane. And then actually we had a guest on a little while ago, just a few weeks now, who brought up a really excellent point in that if you have super speed, you effectively have super strength as well, because force equals mass times acceleration. So yeah, it was a great point. Ever since I heard that, I was like, wow, yeah, that's sold. That's great.
You guys are the best guests.
Yeah. Awesome. So Dusadee, question 4, what is something in healthcare you believe that others might find insane?
Oh, here's a twofer. I don't actually know what anything costs when it comes to services. I think that's crazy because I provide a service, and if a patient's like, how much will it cost for me to get the CT scan? I'm like, Like, I don't know. And the second part of that twofer is that doctors aren't actually taught anything about the business of medicine in medical school. How insane is that? Like, you're going to go into this whole industry having no idea how that industry works. No wonder we're in the situation that we're in. That's crazy.
You know, what's crazy is, like, I feel like people have probably talked about that for decades, and yet, to your point, there probably still isn't very much education on that in the curriculum. Still, I'm guessing it's very limited.
Yeah,
crazy.
Why is that? I mean, that's an interesting question, right? Why have we still not done anything about that? Is it that the people who know are too busy to teach? Is it that there's motivation to not have the doctors know how the industry that they work in works? Like, what is it that's keeping us back from learning about, like, is there some weird perceived thing that if we learn about the business of medicine, we're somehow going to stop caring about the people of medicine? I don't know, but it seems silly to me that we don't learn about how healthcare is run.
No, very, very thought-provoking and true. Yeah, it's good points. Last question. This is more of a pandemic lockdown related question. What is one hobby or activity you've gotten into since the beginning of the pandemic?
Okay, one more. If I tell you, will you tell me yours?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. I started exercising, specifically lifting weights, which, like, I already told you, I'm a total nerd, which meant, like, all the awkwardness that comes with being a nerd. So, like, my arms and legs don't work the way that I tell them to. So it's been an interesting new thing, but really good. It's so good to release some endorphins and, you know, like, She-Hulk it every once in a while on a weight. So
that's amazing. That's great. I don't know. John, we answered this a long time ago, and I don't know if you'd have a different answer now, but Josh did learn a really cool skill during the pandemic.
Well, actually, so I'll comment first. So Dusadee, I actually unfortunately did the opposite of you. So I used to, like, because I had a gym in my condo, so I used to use that like every day. And then when they shut it down during COVID, I stopped. I never stopped using it. So I did the opposite of you. I reversed my weight training journey, and I'm like slowly getting back into it. But the thing that I got to do, actually, so I started cutting my own hair because I had no choice, right? All the hairdressers were closed at the time, and so I bought like hair clippers like off Amazon, and I just, ever since then, like, oh, actually, I cut my own hair last night.
See, I knew it. Yeah, that's great.
I just kept doing it. I don't know, like, I mean, my wife doesn't like it all the time, but she catches all these things I've done wrong.
It looks really good from the front, but if Josh turns around, that's
yeah,
when you know.
like, I know I messed something up last, like, for sure I did.
Oh, that's great. I think my hobby was kind of just getting out more into nature and being mindful of that. So going on like very mindful walks, and
That's
that
cool.
was, yeah, I mean, it's more or less things that we did before the pandemic as well, but to me, it just gave me an excuse to really hone into that. And okay, let me actually like become present with what am I feeling as I go through this nature, and like actually take a look around, kind of just more appreciation for everything around us while this pandemic was happening. I guess that's my hobby activity.
That is beautiful, Alan. That's really cool.
Well, I figured it would strike a chord with you as well, just given your background. I figured, you know, we share that for sure.
Absolutely.
That's great. Well, thanks, Dusadee, again, being mindful of your time. It's a wrap for this episode of the Digital Patient hosted by Seamless MD. You can follow us on Twitter at SeamlessMD if you like the podcast and you want to learn more. You can visit www.seamless.md. Again, Dusadee, thank you so much for sharing your time with us today.
Thank you for having me. This was really fun, you guys.